I've been watching through a bunch of classic movies for the holidays, and it got me thinking, whatever happened to fur coats? They still exist, sure, but they aren't the pinnacle of wealth and achievement that they used to be. In the early 20th century, it seemed like they were the goal. Whether paired with a diamond necklace or a Rolls Royce, a fur coat meant something. Now, not only are they rare, but it's much more likely to see one on someone who thrifted it or raided their grandmother's closet than on a wealthy socialite. While I had always assumed that the environmental movement and the concerns over endangered animals had something to do with it, I felt like there must be something more. After all, we didn't stop wearing animal-inspired clothing. Leopard print certainly keeps coming back over and over again. My first suspicion was with faux fur, a cheap but effective replacement that may have destroyed the entire fur industry. But when and how? Basically, it seems like the strength of fur coats was also, potentially, their weakness. So if we go all the way back to the very end of the 19th century into the 20th century and look at the way that fur coats were treated then, they were outrageously expensive and only owned by a very small group of people. If you are lining an entire coat with fur, something like a muskrat would cost you only about $50, which at the time was still a lot of money. But it would keep you very warm, and that coat should last you for quite a few years. On the more upper end of things, you have stuff like sable, black fox, and otter, which would line a coat for around $5,000. That's a lot of money even in today's value. So most of these fur coats are existing in a range that is not intended for anything except the most elite group. And it continues like that into the 20th century. An article that I found from 1905 talked about the ways that you could manage to get a cheaper fur coat without really going down on quality. So a middling quality sable, which is still one of the preferred furs, as a long coat would be around $44,000. If you brought it up to about a 30-inch coat would be $33,000, and if you make it a really short coat, you could probably get away with $10,000 for a decent quality. So at this point in time, a fur coat, that large a quantity of fur, no matter what type, still reads as very expensive, very wealthy, and really says a lot about the person wearing it, and they're likely to go about their day being treated very differently for wearing it. It is also a very practical option. Lots of people live in very cold places and really needed the furs to get them through winter. They don't have heated cars and other sorts of transit. Even buildings are not nearly as effectively heated. So making sure that you have something that keeps you warm is very important, and that really is the main purpose of fur. Above all else, it will keep you extremely warm, more so than any other option. Because even though wool does very well, it is not insulated to the same extent. It doesn't have the same depth of insulation, so it's inevitably just not going to do as well. And fur coats, even as far back as the very beginning of the 20th century, are presented as an investment. They are a choice to be made by the growing middle class as to whether they want to buy a new wool coat nearly every year as styles change, and the wool coat will generally keep up with that, changing every year. It also is going to show wear and tear around the collar and the cuffs pretty quickly. Or you can buy a fur coat and have that last for multiple years. Maybe 4 or 5 years down the road, a little bit of wear and tear, a little bit of style change means that you just have it remade. What it's made up of is still good quality and can just be updated a little bit. So the fur that you're purchasing can last for many, many years, whereas a wool coat you'll have to buy every few years. So it's considered a good long-term investment, also going back to all of that credit and installment plan sort of system where you could pay as you go and hopefully not have to owe all of it right up front. Fur coat installment plans were definitely a big thing, for good reason, but it was considered an investment. It was considered a goal for the middle class. So it wasn't just the wealthy as we reach into the 20th century. It was something that was the goal of many, many people, to have a decent quality fur coat. This opportunity is not missed by the fabric companies, however. They understand that there are limitations within their own fabrics when it comes to the types of things that fur can do, but they can at the very least make fabric that looks a little bit like fur. So by 1905, fur fabric is starting to be advertised in catalogs and magazines. These are just complex pile fabrics. So much like velvet, where you have a base that is woven, pile is then worked through or knotted into the base fabric, and it's trimmed into different patterns. Depending on whether you have straight or curly fibers, you'll get different looks. Varying up how you are trimming them back can give you different patterns as well. These tend to be either made out of a wool, mohair is a very common option, or a silk, or a blend thereof. So depending on how shiny versus curly and shaggy you need it to be to get the right effect, they have a variety of blends. They also have a lot of very interesting names, because every single textile manufacturer that is coming out with their own special fur fabric wants to make sure that they are differentiated from the others. They give it special names, like mignon or ciselé or meritex. They imitate lots of different types of fur: earl, lynx, pony, angora, but the most common is imitating the caracal sheep. Whether it is in a adult sheep format, as the Persian lamb that we are more familiar with today, or it's the unborn lamb which has an extra shine added to it through pressing called pressed broadtail. You'll also see it in advertisements under many other languages, so a lot of the weird names for these things come from those. It's all under the same family of what we generally today just call Persian lamb. And this is one of the furs which they find the easiest to reproduce in varying ways, with lots of texture and variation to it that makes it look very realistic, and give that lots of different names, like nuka or aluska. Even Sears sold a wool version of this, as well as a silk mole fur, an advertised beaverette, pony, and chinchilla fur fabrics as well. If you are curious what this feels like in terms of something you might have touched in your life, any sort of antique teddy bear or stuffed animal will likely be made out of very similar stuff. Even the modern ones that are meant to be the really fancy old style, they are still using things like mohair in order to make fur fabric today. The question then becomes, does fur fabric threaten the fur industry? Well, in 1921, Fur Age Monthly went and interviewed a whole bunch of professionals in the fur industry, and they all said no. Quite simply, it doesn't offer enough variation, it can't mimic enough types of fur, so it has very limited styles, it wears down too quickly and crushes and mats in comparison to real furs. It also exists on a completely different tax bracket. The people that are wanting to buy a fur coat, or even just attempting to buy a fur coat, aren't going to think about buying a fur fabric coat. And the people that are going to buy a fur fabric coat can't even begin to afford a real fur coat. So the brackets of who the customers aren't overlapping by much, so they're not competing for the same people. They're existing with totally different markets. But inevitably, some of those problems would gradually change over the next few decades. Even as of the mid-1920s, they were starting to make more complex fur fabrics, adding in block printing to make patterns, which was especially popular for what they considered exotic furs, like leopard and tiger. Persian lamb as a real option also grew in popularity throughout the 1930s, therefore, so did the fur fabric version of Persian lamb. Even more brands began creating their own specially named versions of this. Astrania from Blumenthal was one that I found so many advertisements for, and their coats retailed around $15 to $40, which is significantly less than even what cheaper fur coats cost decades before. They said that their customer base were things like college girls and working girls who just didn't have the money to buy fur coats but wanted to look fancy, as well as women that lived in the suburbs or the country who needed a nice coat for nice occasions but didn't need to invest a great deal of money into an everyday fur winter coat, or even sportswomen who wanted a more casual version. Yes, they could afford a nice fancy fur coat for the better events, but for daily wear they wanted something a little more casual that they could just throw on and not worry about. By the 1950s, fake fur is becoming the new term for all of these sorts of fabrics. And as synthetic fabric becomes an option, synthetic fake fur also really takes off. The big turning point for synthetic fake fur is in 1955 at the International Fur Fair. Now, this convention of sorts had been ongoing for plenty of years, but it had never featured or really even shown much in the way of fake fur. But that year, they not only had DuPont, who's well known for their synthetics, doing a seminar, but they also had fake fur options throughout the exhibition and even in the runway show. And the more traditional furriers were really upset about it. There was a very long article written talking all about the opinions that people had over this, and it's clear that by this point, the fur industry saw fake fur as a threat, as a foe and opponent, instead of one facet of the community or too small to worry about. Though not everyone felt that way, one seller that they interviewed talked about how he does carry a small quantity of fake furs, specifically the Persian lamb, or the mouton processed lamb, as he calls it, which looks very realistic and is more worthwhile than the actual type, because real Persian lamb is very heavy and thick, and it just doesn't make for a good large coat. So the fake version is actually preferable to the real in many cases. He also says that it's really good as a second coat option, so people that would typically come in, purchase a nice real fur coat, would want a second one that's out of fake fur, which is cheaper, and they don't have to worry about getting it dirty or messed up. Just not nearly as concerning for everyday wear. Interestingly, Albrecht Fur Company, who was one of the ones pushing fake fur at this event, wrote back a letter to the editor on this article, talking about their Borgana brand furs and why they think they're so important. Not only do they have a lower price range, which brings more people into the industry, as far as they're concerned, they don't damage any of the regular fur sales aside from mouton, Persian lamb, but they can also be cleaned and repaired like fur. So in Albrecht's opinion, it was more a supplementary option. It wasn't an alternative to so much as this is something that fur companies can offer and sell and treat just like regular furs because they are cleaned and maintained in much the same way. They will go through the same process. They are even constructed in very similar manners, and they could sell these, bringing in a whole wide range of customers that otherwise would be uncomfortable or unable to really shop in that store. So they saw this as an expansion of the fur industry rather than competition with it. However, they were one of the few that really saw it this way, and when the FTC started cracking down on the use of terminology when it came to fake furs, putting out a lot of reminders in 1963 that you cannot use terms like leopard or pony or any sort of term that refers back to the animal like it is a real fur. You can use made up words, you can say fake fur, but you cannot say fake leopard fur. And the standard fur industry rejoiced at this, saying, look, this is why there'll never be competition for us. They can't even advertise things in the way that they would need to be competition for us. So we're just gonna let the government take care of that problem and they'll fade away. It's just a fad. This whole synthetic fur thing won't last. Clearly, they hadn't caught on to the fact that they said the same thing in the 1920s and it had still managed to last for decades up until that point. And as we reached the 1970s, a whole bunch of things started to coalesce into the turning point for real and fake fur. First up, we go back to that environmentalism and conservation efforts really worked towards getting people to stop wearing endangered animals, so tiger and leopard and more what they would call exotic furs within the industry, things that were making a severe impact on the environmental situation. So they started there because that was a pretty easy message to get across. People were concerned about endangering animals and all that. Made sense. From there, they then started to look at the fur industry, no different than the farming industry, and looked at how the treatment of animals, both as they are raised and how they are processed, was not always humane, especially in the 1970s, and they really went very hard on that and put out a bunch of advertisements and really pushed that image forward as much as they could to get people to turn away from both the fur and meat industries. Now, what really brought it forward, though, more so than these groups that were sort of on the fringes of society making these statements, were some of the adoptions by celebrities of the idea that they no longer wanted to wear real fur. So people like Bob Barker made a really big difference in people deciding to stop wearing real fur, or even when Carolina Herrera and Bill Blass in the late 1980s said that they were no longer going to use real fur in their fashion collections. That was another big hit. So throughout the 70s and 80s, a lot of famous people came forward and declared that they were no longer going to be using real furs. Real furs, especially something like a whole fur coat, really took on this very unpleasant appearance of a wealthy person who was very disconnected from society, didn't care about animals or the world or the environment. This was the rich bourgeoisie at their most extreme. More and more people didn't want to be associated with that imagery. Alternatively, the whole idea of class consciousness and the meaning of the fur coat was also starting to shift for the very wealthy. The price of things like mink, which was previously a very expensive and popular fur coat, one of the ones that was a great achievement, was dropping substantially to the point where it was starting to become considered a blue-collar working class option, something that almost anyone could manage to save up and achieve. It used to be at the low end, something like $600 would manage maybe to get you a good mink coat. Apparently, as of the 1970s, it was more like $133, which is very affordable. Yes, they are still dramatically different than the $10,000 coat that you could get from the nicer stores, but when you see someone walking down the street, is there significant enough difference to clock that right away? Apparently not, because wealthy women were saying that they no longer got quite the same level of respect that they used to get when they were out wearing fur coats. And so instead, in order to signal to other wealthy people that they were not part of that blue-collar mink group, they started purchasing much more trendy versions. They went for minks in bright colors, pastels, in interesting and trendy cuts, which of course meant that they had a high turnover rate and were only good for a few years because they were out of style very quickly, and thus showing that they still had a lot of money, but doing so through a more fast fashion method than I invested thousands upon thousands of dollars into this coat. It's more I'm able to buy a bubblegum pink coat for the season and not wear it ever again. So the wealthy had double the reason to distance themselves from the traditional aesthetic of the wealthy woman in a fancy fur coat in the traditional style. They didn't want to be associated with any of that stuff anymore. Of course, add on to the changing mindset around fur that synthetics just made all of it irrelevant. They came up with more and more styles and variations. They were more and more realistic. And the fact that they were now made out of plastic meant that they didn't have the same problems as the earlier versions did. They didn't crush down or mat down. They didn't need a lot of extra care in order to keep them looking nice. These things, frankly, will never really fade away. Yes, you can ruin a faux fur coat. Frankly, it takes a fair amount of effort. It's not going to just wear down quickly. So the lower prices in real fur and the wide range of fake fur meant that there was now an overlap in the price and therefore an overlap in the customer base. And frankly, a good fake was less expensive than a poor quality real fur. And once that happened, lots of people are much more interested in buying a stylish, cheaper version of a fur coat, not have to worry about treating it like a lifetime investment. Add in the fact that synthetics also made a variety of different coat styles that were warm, very possible, whereas fur really was the elite option for staying warm in very cold weather, and it still is very good at that. Things like puffer coats or any sort of insulated sections of the coats where they take spun polyester and fill the space and give you a bunch of air gaps in order to stay warm meant that you don't even have to try for a fake fur coat. There are options that will keep you warm without any of the aesthetics of fur, or the care of fur for that matter. Ironically, because synthetics sort of became the replacement for fur in a practical sense, not just an aesthetic one, it didn't actually help on the environmental issue side. Though fur is obviously its own set of issues, things like synthetic fibers, which are inherently plastic, also are not great for the environment. Not only are they made out of things like petroleum, which obviously create a lot of negative environmental impact in their production, but also in their care and lifespan, and the fact that once they do get thrown away, worn out, whatever, they aren't going to break down. They're going to be in that landfill for a very long time. So they aren't good for the environment, and certainly not a good replacement for real fur if that's the concern. Personally, I would absolutely love to see more versions of faux fur that were based off of the older methods, using wool, and obviously silk's pretty expensive, but viscose, rayon, which while technically a synthetic because of the process, is not made of plastic. It is a cellulosic-based fiber like cotton or linen is instead. So it's not a natural fiber, but it's much closer to that. And while these sorts of fur fabrics made out of wool or viscose are available. They're very expensive today because they just aren't produced on a large scale. We don't really have the setup for that. They are mostly aimed at that classic teddy bear industry. All the fabric samples that I showed throughout this video all came from Intercal, who has a wide range of these types of fur fabrics. And that includes the fur fabric trimmings that I used on my coat in the video about the purpose behind fashion in general. So there are better alternatives out there that are hopefully potentially less damaging to the environment if that is something you are concerned with, but they're just going to be very expensive. Hopefully at some point that starts to change. But for now, I'm just happy to see that wool as an option seems to be making a comeback when it comes to coats and other things of that nature. Synthetics in general are a bit of a sticky subject, and in fact, I'm going to be doing an entire video on that coming up very soon. So be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell because that's coming your way very soon, and I know that the subject of synthetic fabrics has been one of the most asked for topics in my entire channel history.